that really sounded impressive. I'm impressed as well, but it's not all true. Basically, what I did was made a sound career decision early on. I attached myself to John Walters, and I found a man of leadership and integrity that I have found unmatched. And I simply have stayed with him in his shadow and been well served thereby. He led the office that I served. He would have been your guest if it had not been for conflict of interest today. I will fill in, but it is to him that I owe not only my experiences, but I think that the nation owes a huge debt for his leadership and understanding and the hard work that he does extraordinarily here. I'm from Washington. It means we know things. With regard to tomorrow, Air Force by 6. For those of you who care. And it puts me in mind, I'm supposed to tell a humanizing anecdote, and I do have tendency to talk a lot, I'll probably go over and so forth, but I do want to tell you this. I grew up in Southern California in the 60s. I played high school football. We were a disaster. We lost a lot, had a bad injured knee. I blamed the coach with good reason. His name was Neumeier. He was a disaster. He didn't understand football. He had 2 plays, blast 0, which ran into the pile and fall down, and then the flat pass that got intercepted every single time for a touchdown. And he would call it routinely, play after play. So I blamed him. It was over 50 years ago. I've let it go, as you can see. We were a big school, like 4,000 people by the time I graduated, and we should have been good. I then was stunned to learn a few years later that Jack Neumeier was coach of the year in Los Angeles. Big deal, and they won the city championship with an undefeated team. That very coach I remember. Well, what he'd done was he found a new quarterback, and that fellow's name was John Elway. I wonder what happened to him. The story does have a point. So in my senior year, rather than sports, I took a drama class. I was an unlikely fit, but the girls were incredible. And I had a drama coach from Hollywood, Mr. Raleigh, and that year we did Euripides, we put on Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. You get stabbed. It doesn't end well. And then we put on a play that mattered a lot to me and it stayed with me almost all my life now, I think about it. It was a play by Henrik Ibsen, sort of social justice warrior. And it's about a small town that is famous and prosperous because it has baths, springs, mineral springs, waters. People from all over Europe come to the baths. And it makes everybody happy and prosperous. And then Dr. Stockman, the protagonist of the play, learns a terrible secret. The waters are contaminated. They're poisoning people. They're making people sick. And he goes to the town fathers and mayor and health officials. And he said, this is a crisis. We've got to close them. And the play is called, anybody know it? Yeah. An Enemy of the People. Now, and it's the difficulties of Dr. Stockman trying to get the springs closed and to mobilize over what is clearly a threat. But it's productive of money. What are you going to do? By the way, do you know who is the enemy of the people? It's not the town father. It's Dr. Stockman. It's the people who stand up. It's a proud time. So, my point today would be, you are the point of the spear here in Colorado. You're in the front line through the trenches. You don't always see the broader framework that takes place around you. And in my years with government experience and being sent around various places, there were certain lessons that came forward. And they're not real crystal clear because policy is tough and we won some and we lost some. But I want to give you some lessons that are broader from other contexts. That's sort of a dumb break. Where you are and what's happened and where this might go. And then I don't really have solutions, but I can tell you at least what is the nature of this activity, because I think there's a campaign, not only to legalize marijuana, but to legalize acceptability of drug use in America and globally. And I've seen this campaign and learned a great deal about it. So that's my effort today, is to try and present what we've learned. And I will go kind of far afield. Only some of this is going to be about marijuana per se. Now, it does occur to me, though, if legalization were a good argument, if it's a great idea, why are the arguments behind it always kind of misleading or deceptive, in fact, known to not be true? The first premise is, well, we've got to do something different because whatever we're doing now, it's a failure. The drug war has been futile. A huge expense of money, trillions of dollars, made no difference whatsoever. In fact, it's just made things worse. The presence of the law just ruins lives, and it's driven people into the shadows, and it's actually created social disaster. It is the problem. The cure is worse than the disease. Time to do something different. Let's do reform. Let's do legalization. It will cure the ills of the law itself. No, the drugs themselves, yeah, they're kind of risky, but they should be regulated. It would take charge of this. And it's that what we've been doing is wrong and has been counterproductive. And by the way, marijuana is just, it's kitty dope. It's not a serious health threat. It's not, I mean, there's heroin, cocaine, and it's Schedule 1. Why the heck is marijuana in Schedule 1, for heaven's sakes? It's not killing people. So it's not really a serious health threat, so we've way overreacted from that. And moreover, the premise is legalization and revenue enhancement will be sufficient to cover the costs. It will, pay for schools. Will help out the economy. And it's like the arsonist is saying, but we're going to pay for the fire department. Well, wait a minute, why not, is that really working here? We're going to provide for treatment and so forth, and youth education, because the revenues will exceed the cost burden. That's simply not true. The legal market will drive out the violent black market. We regulate this, then the criminal element will be pushed away. It's what Lenin used to say about the state, Through the communist revolution, the state will wither away of its own, and will be the workers' paradise. And that, moreover, the worst thing you can do in drug policy is to try to control the supply. It's not cost effective, you can't really do it, you're down there swatting flies in Colombia or Afghanistan. There's no impact, and it's the least productive thing you want to do. You want prevention, and everybody agrees, I agree. You want prevention, it's the single most effective thing. How? How do you do prevention? How does the federal government do prevention? You have to see a good answer. I'm going to suggest that one of the most effective prevention measures is to control the supply. Then your prevention efforts gain traction. And they lose traction when the supply is abundant, available, cheap, and normatively accessible. And that finding that this argument's been very persuasive to some, particularly libertarians, that Colorado law represents federalism. The state's experimenting. And I'm in favor of that in general, but that's a fraud. That's not what's going on here. This is the abrogation by the federal government of responsibilities to uphold federal law. And they changed the deliberate effort to change the priorities of prosecution. What Colorado did for its vote is irrelevant. This was the willing complicity of the administration to say, we allow you to do this because it fits our policy agendas. Like immigration law, they selectively enforce federal laws. And that's not federalism and self-initiative driven. That's the agreement and abrogation of the federal government. And my impression is they will turn it on and turn it off at will. They're still in charge. I think we will learn that. So here we go. The Los Angeles Times recently came out with an editorial in support of legal marijuana in California, and they made all these arguments over and over again, along with some other ones. By the way, the Rand Corporation did do a look at this notion that in no Western country is the user really at much criminal risk currently for being penalized for marijuana. We simply do not do much about marijuana possession and use in terms of criminal justice, hammering, and crackdown. It's simply not the case. So why are we legalizing? Because the claim is that marijuana possession and use have driven incarceration, mass incarceration, federal arrests. Our prisons are overcrowded. It's costing us enormous, it's breaking lives, it's ruinous. It's not true. Marijuana use and possession is less than 0.5% of federal prisoners. We don't arrest and sentence and convict and incarcerate people for use. We're not slam dunking some kid with a baggie in the back of the stadium. Doesn't happen. And you can demonstrate that by pointing out that of federal prisoners, 99.5% of them are in prison for drug offenses for heavy drug trafficking. 25% of them are not U.S. citizens, and federal repeated drug trafficking offenses with large loads are the reason they're in prison. When you then eliminate the laws against marijuana use and possession, you don't get some dividend of people coming out of prison. There aren't any. Even the president's having difficulty for his clemency initiatives, finding people who fit the profile of low-level nonviolent offenders. They don't exist. it's a fraud. And that somehow the drug war produces distinctively racial disparities and injustices. Now, it's true that the rate of arrests for African Americans is 3 times their presence in the population, and it is a disparity. However, it's not distinctive for the drug laws. It's not that the drug law system, the war on drugs, has been a peculiar episode in trying to undermine African American communities. The disparities are greater in other areas of the law, like assault, like homicide. It is the drug laws are one of the lower rates of differential. There are problems in the community, and in particular, minority and vulnerable populations suffer the most victimization from drug use and drug trafficking. It protects them more than people with resources to have the laws available as a resource. If you travel to treatment centers, if you go into inner city communities, it is the local population that says we need help with the law because of drug trafficking that is ruining our communities, our lives, and our children. The legal market will drive out violence and eliminate the black market. We can talk about this a little more because I think it's really critical. I think you know in Colorado, this has not happened. Revenues from taxation exceed costs? No, it simply is not the case. And each point has been refuted by the data in multiple statements and gets ignored. They will not honor the arguments of the actual empirical facts. To the contrary. Why? Because to some extent, both the legalizers have an agenda, and this doesn't fit their agenda, and the people who report to the wider public have a narrative. And their narrative gives them a commitment. And there is a bias in the system, in our experience, that they are unwilling to report or very selectively report what we now know about the health effects, about the reality of criminal justice incarceration, about racial disparities. They can be presented over and over and again with credible arguments, and they simply ignore them because the narrative captures their attention. They think this is a civil rights battle that is a glorious achievement, that they're liberating something, and I think they're committed to that. And it's very difficult to operate in that environment when the truth and the facts are not dispositive. All right, what's happened, and this is not a surprise. We've seen this episode played out before Colorado, before the United States. For instance, both Sweden and Great Britain liberalized drug policies. And both of them retrenched and said, oops, mistake, when the damage started to come in. They backed away fairly quickly. The Netherlands famously started their cannabis cafes. And as you may know, recently, the government of the Netherlands has decided, you know what? This is not working like we thought. After all these years, they found criminal elements, they found degradation of neighborhoods, prostitution, difficulties, panhandling, arrests were going up for drug tourism, and they were finding a deteriorating situation that was not in control. And there was not only that, they found the native wheat, the high potency drugs, about 15%, were incredibly damaging. So they began to restrict the potency, and began to restrict the number of cafes, and they are very much limiting them. No foreign tourists can come. They're trying to dig their way back out of that hole they dug themselves into. Over time, by the way, and this is interesting, fairly common, when they initiated the liberalized policies, there was not an immediate impact on prevalence rates. Many people expected it. Same with Portugal. There'll be an explosion. Well, it doesn't seem to be the case. It's not as though there's a whole bunch of people waiting till their law says, oh, it's okay, and they simply jump into marijuana use. But what does happen is as a generation emerges, socialized under the new norms of acceptability, and it becomes commercialized, and it becomes normatively accepted, those children and youth become high users. And sure enough, that's what happened, 15 to 44% increase in 18 to 20-year-olds in the Netherlands, but it took about a decade before that started to happen. Same thing's happening in Portugal. We can talk about Portugal later as kind of an example it is of drug legalization. It's actually much more like our drug court system. People are accosted, stopped, and referred into a drug court-like system for treatment. Nonetheless, they have seen their youth use of cannabis begin to spiral up as the generation emerges. So, small immediate impact, but for the emerging generation, higher rates happen. In Canada, it's also moved towards liberalizing of medical marijuana and even state-sponsored marijuana grows. They now have, for the 11 to 15-year-olds, the highest rates in the world, according to UNICEF, and the World Health Organization for that age bracket. So it hasn't been good for them. The prevalence increase is steady, but oftentimes what we see is not an explosion of prevalence, where it's simply year by year it goes up dramatically, but oftentimes what happens is that users enter the system and they intensify their use, the frequency increases. Those who were occasional past year users now become past months. Those who were past month users now start using 3-4 times a week. And eventually they become daily users. So that is an increase in use, but the categories of our survey instruments don't capture it carefully. They kind of have past year, past month, and then daily. But in between that is this gradual progression of intensification of use and, of course, potency. Now, NESCAR, the National Epidemiologic Survey of Alcohol and Related Conditions, did recently posit that we've seen a marijuana use doubling and a marijuana disorder doubling in the United States between 2001 and 2013. Seems generally true, but what's really interesting to me is the shape of that doubling. It's a V. It didn't happen steadily from 2001 to 2013. From 2001 until roughly 2007, it went down about 18%, both of those. And from 2009 until 2013, it rose. So when you end up at the end doubling, but it's composed of that, down and up. That's important, because policy's changed. So here's my argument. Controlling the drug supply is an effective prevention strategy. At the very least, if you can't control it totally, don't increase it. It's a pathogen. Don't enable it to become more widely accessible, more normatively accepted. And it's very easy, not very easy, it's easier when you have limited source cultigens like cocaine, coca leaf, or opium poppy. Only a few places in the world grow them in unguarded havens that are lawless. The Andes, Afghanistan, parts of Mexico. You can constrain them and you can set up against them. It's much harder with synthetics and precursors, the chemicals that come in to form methamphetamine or the new synthetic analogs of heroin that are spreading rapidly, because they don't give the visible signature of a crop being grown. Extremely difficult to control, but it can be done by limitations on chemical exports and by monitoring the sites of production. It's much more difficult, however, to simply control the supply of ubiquitous cannabis. We have it in the national forests, we have it in multiple states, we've got millions of plants in California, we've got indoor grows, we've got BC bud, and people growing it in their closets. And now it's available. It's very difficult to use supply only, but for heaven's sakes, don't elaborate and just make more available what is there, and you can make efforts against it that we have failed to do successfully. Okay, here are my lessons, and I'm going to go broadly into a new context. This is Colombia. During the period of time we served, basically 2001 to 2013, we saw a very dramatic reduction in the hectares of coca cultivation in Colombia as the primary provider of cocaine for the United States. Pretty steep decline. It was led by aerial eradication, alternative development strategies, and imposing the rule of law. A huge revolution in Colombia that stabilized their cocaine production and looked very successful. And you see the consequences of controlling supply. So here's my first lesson. Control the supply and drug consequences will follow. Took a little while because this is a trailing indicator, but these are overdose deaths for cocaine in the United States. Took about a year and a half for the cocaine from Colombia to get here, and people had to use it for a while before they got dependent enough that they were susceptible to overdose. So this was a climbing, lagging indicator in 2006. That's really bad news, by the way, that overdose deaths are a lagging indicator, because it means that changes have already taken place in the system, they just haven't manifested themselves yet. Cocaine supply, or drug supply generally, can be hugely increased, and you think you're doing fine. And then 2 or 3 years later, it's already in the system and it's just unfolding and revealing itself. That's where we are today. Notice, however, that something went wrong here. This should be starting going down because we did reduce the supply. Why did it go back up? Here's the same metric converted into metric tons. 700 metric tons of pure cocaine coming out of Colombia was reduced to 165 metric tons. I've got a pointer. 165 metric tons in 2012. That's an enormous, it's a 75% reduction. Why on earth? Because policy's changed. a new administration came in, that very different approach towards Colombia, stopped the programs, and a huge unraveling took place, and cocaine took off dramatically, and that's why we see the increase in overdose deaths once again. Let's go to another example. How much heroin does the United States use? Well, traditionally we used to estimate around 18 metric tons total for everybody in the country. And Canada, another cluster. However, in 2011, we saw a newly installed Mexican government, not Felipe Calderon, but in fact Enrique Peña Nieto, and they suddenly came out with an estimated 30 metric tons of pure heroin. What the heck are they doing with all that? They're heading for the US market. Why such a surplus? And it kind of stayed steady. There were some artifacts of methodology changing. Here's why it doesn't go up so dramatically. And then we measure again. In 2014, it's gone 42 metric tons. What the heck? Who's using all this stuff? Where's it going? The supply is increasing. And then last year, we capped 70 metric tons. This is a 62% increase over the 20. Where are they going? Where's the market? Who's using this stuff? Can we see it anywhere? Oops. Here are the consequences of available illicit supply from Mexico has come into the system, and sure enough, we begin to capture in our very inadequate household survey instruments, there's an increase. Oh my goodness. And here are the overdose deaths. Look how stable overdose deaths have been for years, roughly in here. Increased supply took off, and bang. And this is 2014 data. Remember what I said about lagging indicators? Guess what? This is going to go up. We just haven't measured it yet. Matter of fact, it's accelerating up. More deaths are already in the cards. And here's the last example. This is a market phenomenon this time. It is prescription, familiar, right? Opioid, IMS Health prescriptions. And we see the steady increase, and eventually CDC and NIDA and the government get after this and say, look, we got to go and change doctor practice, doctor education, and we see it tailing off on the overdose, or in the prescriptions, so that the pharmacies began to slow. And sure enough, in 2006, we began to see a downturn in the prevalence rates. It's been slow and steady, but it's moving. And then we see the overdose deaths prescriptions. And they do actually begin to tail off in the last 2 years, except for a whoopsie. We've seen this before, haven't we? What happened in 2014? Why does it go back up? In this case, I think there's another dimension. It's this. We had a new drug, synthetic opioid, come into the system that had not been prevalent before. Fentanyl. And because fentanyl is used in anesthesia and surgery, it was assumed and logged by the CDC as part of the pharmaceutical. No, it was illicit fentanyl coming out of illicit labs in Mexico. We'd seen it back in 2006 in Toluca, Mexico, made an outbreak of overdose in Chicago. It came back, and suddenly it's driving. So if we made the proper correction here, we would see that we've got two epidemics for opioids, licit and illicit. They feed each other. One is a market phenomenon that's controlled and regulated. Well, that shouldn't be happening. How can it be the second worst drug problem in America when it's controlled and regulated like they want marijuana to be? Apparently it's not sufficient. It still produces abuse and overdose deaths. And then it's met by an escalating illicit phenomenon. They feed on each other, they reinforce each other, and now you even get the argument, somewhat true, that there's a crossover. People accept the gateway when it's argued with respect to prescription opiates. Now the reality is 3 out of 4 new heroin initiates apparently began with prescription opiates. Doesn't look like there's a wholesale movement from people who use pills and now go in and check. What seems to happen is that it's additive. People who are dependent begin to use whatever opiate they got available. Opana, Dilaudid, Oxycontin, heroin, fentanyl, what do you got? And it becomes, they mutually feed each other, which I think is a parallel to what we might see in Colorado. The illicit black market, the legal market, they begin to cross, fertilize, and fire each other up. So what's the scope? Again, we don't have good data. We're back to 2014. How can the CDC not know? Because we don't get medical examiner reports. 47,000 deaths, 28,000 of them at this point from any opioid, 18,893 analgesics, which is actually going down, and it's been exceeded now by heroin if we made the correct calculation. And those are 2 years ago. I assure you, it is worse now because the fentanyl, we just found this. And notice, by the way, supply, in a sense, creates demand. There was no demand for fentanyl. People wondering, hey, where do we find this stuff? I've heard about it. But suddenly it shows up. These are DEA exhibits in forensic lab criminal investigations. That's an astonishing rise. And it's being pushed by, we call them drug pushers, into the system, and it's being fed into the heroin supply, and it's killing people like crazy because it's multiple times more potent than heroin, as is carfentanil and the new generation of drugs that are all opioids. So somehow supply can either be reduced and then produce drug consequences that are positive, or supply can be left to itself, and when it expands, the consequences rush towards us. This is already happening in the system. Just so you get a wider sense of what's going to happen next, we finally have some data out of Maryland, and these are areas where there's a traditional Baltimore heroin market, and in the first 6 months of 2016 compared to the first 6 months of the year prior, heroin's rising still, 68%, fentanyl 268%, and prescription opioids at 10%. What we discover, by the way, is that there may be some mutual reinforcement across both of these epidemics. Not only is cocaine coming back, but the opioid epidemic and the widespread dimension of marijuana have some relationship with each other, that they may be fueling each other. It's not completely clear. Not arguing that there is a strict gateway to understanding that marijuana potentiates opioid use, so there are some suggestions to that effect. But what they seem to both depend upon is a collapse of the norms of the acceptability of drug use and the availability and distribution patterns of drug pushing and trafficking. And that they both, because people who traffic drugs are polydrug traffickers. They'll move marijuana, they'll move opiates, they'll move cocaine, and people who are users are polydrug users. Most heroin users, 99% of them began with marijuana. Now, it may not be causal, but it's a reality. And they are therefore 3 times more likely to become heroin addicted, marijuana users compared to non-marijuana users. And heavy marijuana use in early adolescence is linked to a relative risk 15 times greater if it is high potency. And we're just now discovering what that might mean. So here we get some other lessons. Prescriptions are legal, regulated, and still deadly. It didn't solve the problem. Legal, regulated markets coexist with black market operations. The problem is not solved. The cartels feast on this and move in rapidly and take advantage of expanded prevalence and the confusion and incapacity of law enforcement. They cannot any longer distinguish between some dope that's proper and some dope that's illegal. And they don't know what to do, and they've been disabled, and the court system has as well. Under any scenario, however, prohibition is a necessary part of the response. I talk to people who say, let's have legal adult marijuana. Well, what about the kids? Always be prohibited. Well, wait. You said all along that prohibition is a failure and only makes things worse. Al Capone. Yeah, well, we'll prohibit it to them, and that'll work. How? And then finally, under any scenario, this I learned particularly in Colombia and in Peru. If you have drug traffickers who are making them grow under the threat of a gun, and you say, I've got an alternative development plan here. I've got palm oil or illicit crops, and I'll build roads and schools and hospitals in Peru or in southern Colombia. Do you know what happens? They get capitalized upon by the black market. They use those to get their product to market. They burn the schools. They undermine the hospitals. And you've got to first not expect your legal market to simply drive them out all on its own because it's a shinier object. You've got to suppress them actively. You must engage with the black market and break its back, or it will take over whatever you've done, and all you've done is facilitated them. It seems to be the lesson out of the Andes. I don't know whether that's what we're seeing here, but it seems to me that we don't have the ordering of this correctly. We have to stage this. If you want legal regulated drugs, you can't do it in the presence of a violent, coercive black market. Okay, then finally, my last example is sort of other worlds. You talk about microcosms, the District of Columbia. How am I doing for time, by the way? I'm okay. Believe me, I'll burn it. So. I come to the District of Columbia, that was also one of the places that liberalized at the same time Colorado, Oregon, and Washington State. And it's such a microcosm for legal access because it's a smaller area and they finally got some immediate data. And moreover, it's about the most vulnerable population because it's heavily African American and a lot of poor people with high violence and crime rates. So you can kind of see in a concentrated fashion what's happened to them. So the Department of Public Health just now in July 2016, and the Washington Post did not cover it. This is the results. Marijuana, past month use, high school, 32.3. First use under age 13, 17.5%. Demographics, 13% used by whites, 21.6% amongst African Americans. That rate is increasing amongst the African American population who can least withstand the impact on their opportunities, on their futures. In treatment for marijuana disorder, 4,395 compared to 117. People without resources, without strong, structured families and socioeconomic standing and access to the 34 clinic get hammered when they adopt patterns of addiction. And they end up in publicly funded treatment systems being hurt. Twice the rate of current tobacco use for marijuana users of binge drinking, also higher. Receiving rates, DNF, 51%. Now, this has got a huge dropout problem and a huge school failure problem already in this community. How is losing 8 IQ points, as we hear from the New Zealand longitudinal study, supposed to help that? And the association with school suspension, job firing, high-risk sexual behavior just makes everything worse for a struggling community that suffers under oppression as it is, and its opportunities are few. And what they get hit with is liberalized dope. Isn't helping. Okay, now, nothing ever works, everything's futile, drug policy has never been successful. Well, come on. We've made major changes over time. This is monitoring the future, the only continuous survey unchanged since 1975 with regard to seniors. We've got that continuously now. That's a roller coaster of steep rises, and this is the height of drug use in the United States, broadly, 79 through 85, a cocaine, crack epidemic. When the people talk about, seniors are using marijuana now more, that's largely a cohort effect. It's the pig through the python. They were the 45 to 65-year-olds who are using, they're not going out with grandma and saying, I'm going to try this meth I've heard so much about. They were the kids who were 15 in 1975 and they established lifelong patterns of use. And they're just aging through the system. Now, some people are. Adults are, in fact, experimenting more. But that's not what's really driving the change that we're seeing demographically. And then, look where we went. By 1992, we bottomed out. The lowest rates we'd seen in a long, long time, that then escalate very quickly, and then sort of plateau, and then start downward again. It's tendentious, but it's also what the data show. One can draw administration boundaries across this dimension. This is Carter, this is Reagan through Bush 41, this is Clinton 1, this is Clinton 2, and that's Barry McCaffrey. Stabilized things in the Office of National Drug Policy, General McCaffrey, fought a good fight. This is 2001, Bush 43, and this is now Obama. Policies matter, philosophies matter. How acceptable. It's not just partisan politics, and the best thing you've got to do is make your drug policy non-partisan, so it gets sustained over time and doesn't reverse and unravel when administrations change. Can't be contingent on who holds office. It's a question of leadership, it's a question of moral will, of normative expectations, of perceptions of risk. And those change, and drug use will follow, for youth in particular, the most sensitive indicator. Just so you don't get lost in how much this matters, we're getting a closer look. That's the actual downturn that we saw between 2001 and 2007, 8, 9. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the 79 through, that's the steepness. This is back up again, we're looking at the same area. But this is with all 3 grades, 12, 10, and 8. And the downturn in 2007 doesn't look like a lot until you actually zero in. That's a 24% decline. This is the period now that we ended up with, 2001 through 2007, 2008, and it kind of plateaus again and then goes up steeply. That's a 24% decline in youth use, past month, regular use of marijuana. Of any illicit drug, and 25% for marijuana. Marijuana drives the monitoring the future. It's the biggest one we can actually measure. Heroin use, which doesn't drive this, so small. Well, how many people is that? It's 900,000 youth. Nearly 1 million kids stopped using or didn't start, and the rates fell dramatically. That's 1 million kids. It's worthwhile. Makes a difference because marijuana prevalence is so widespread. The disease burden is huge because of it. Millions of people using it. If you can make a change there, this is the final report card for 2008, 2007. Any illicit drug went down 24%. Marijuana was the driver of this, but the other drugs seem to have followed. We see downturns, at least in a high school. There's again very small absolute numbers, but they all trended in the same direction: methamphetamine, steroid use, alcohol, and cigarettes. It was a broad, comprehensive, and relatively successful change in the norms of student approach to intoxicants. And it wasn't just policy. There were things happening in the culture that were maybe 9/11, maybe a sense of responsibility. I don't know what was happening, but there were differences during this time period that were at least enhanced by leadership. And look at that 14.8% up there as where we ended up, 12.4% for marijuana. Because here's the record carried on out till now. And here's 2006, 7, 8, 9, and we're now up not 14%, we're at 22.7%. This is 8th, 10th, same survey, monitoring the future, 3 grades, recent study. So we see percentage of students in the past 30 days, the most policy relevant. So we've really lost a lot of ground here in the period from here to here. And it's comprehensive across all 3 grades, though mostly amongst the seniors. It's very difficult to roll that back, but it can be done. And now this is a mystery. I don't know what it means, and anybody I talked to, and we've already talked about it several times today, but we know we've got increased potency. We at least did a look at what is the association between the year-by-year rise in potency of seized marijuana from DEA, which was going up basically 1% a year, up to 10%. Notice the years is 2007, so we're way past that now. We're at 12.5 overall for the DEA, but the special markets are 18, 20%, and then on up to 80% for the concentrates, as you know. And here's emergency rooms, visits, for which marijuana was the primary reason. Nationwide Dawn used to be the system. It's been eliminated, by the way. Data sets have disappeared. Budgets have been cut. National drug control policy itself, the office has been cut. Whole programs have been eliminated. And sure enough, we're having problems. And we're not even measuring them because those data sets went away. That's why I can't show you what happens if we go on past 2007. Okay. This also suggests to me that we're conducting an experiment. We have some sense that potency matters. Maybe they titrate, maybe it's hard to titrate when you don't really know what you've got. How do you smoke less or something? Is it 20%? Is it, I don't know, try it. You're going to titrate. No, it looks like the rate of change of the delivery of the dose seems to have a relationship to the capacity to become dependent quickly. That the impact is a qualitatively different kind of drug. Everywhere we look at this. See this in the UK with Sir Robin Murray and psychosis, schizophrenia. It is associated with high potency and early developmental exposure. We've started an experiment. We don't know where it goes. And it's already in the cards. The high potency has been out there. Every one of the longitudinal studies that we rely on to reassure ourselves or to worry ourselves about the impact on youth of marijuana exposure, our longitudinal studies in New Zealand, like it, they're 3%. They've been going 20, 30 years. What is the impact longitudinally on a 14-year-old exposed today to 12 to 15% or higher? We don't know. We've already done it. Now we're going to see it unfold in 10 years. We're committed. We're on board here. This ship has sailed. Okay. Is there a gateway? Yeah, I think so. It's not clear to me how exactly it works. Monitoring the Future, the director from the University of Michigan says, we have entered the second relapse phase in America for the epidemic of drug use. That was our 90, the big V curve went up and down. And if you look, the first specific drug associated with initiation of any illicit drug is, in fact, marijuana, 70%. Looks like that is the pathway for risk and exposure. Whether it's neurophysiologically changing and priming, I don't know. But it does seem to be the pathway of greatest risk. And if you don't limit the supply, availability, normative acceptance, you're not going to get there. Perceptions of risk matter. And here's the scope of the problem nationwide now. This is the most recent National Household Survey, past month use. We've got 22.2 million marijuana users in the country on a regular basis, about ages 12 and older. That's an enormous population of people. The population of Canada is what, 34 million, 35 million? So it's a whole nation. Culture change. Very difficult. We've hit a tipping point, threshold of involvement. Much bigger than the other drugs in terms of social consequences, social costs. All right, so the drug legalization campaign, of which you are now the recipient, moves by incrementalism. And the progression everywhere seems to be the same. First introduce medical marijuana with suffering patients and enlist sympathy and say it's actually and then get that passed at the state level. Every single one of the medical marijuana states, by the way, 22 through 24, depending on which year you make the calculation, has marijuana use rates above the national average. So it is presumably having some impact. Then after you've sort of softened things up with medical marijuana, then rolls in the effort to say, well, look, it's commercial marijuana, make it recreational, and the gateway effects and normalization seem to take over from there. And sure enough, the next phase is being prepared. Watch the opioid crisis to see where the drug legalization campaign, which is global and encompasses all drugs and just leads with marijuana because they know they can get the best buy-in. It's a soft drug. We're ruining lives by locking people up. It's going to now call for harm reduction techniques more broadly. And we're seeing nationwide the federal government issuing needles for injection, naloxone for overdose. Well, that's great. We need naloxone. It's life-saving, but it's responding to the consequences of the epidemic, not the causes. They're doing nothing to stop the flow into the country, or doing far too little of the drug supply, and they're sitting back and smoothing and reviving and treating, but that's not the way to end an epidemic. And they're now calling for nationwide supervised injection facilities. The government sponsors them. Heroin provision as the treatment for heroin, and still the criminal black market thrives on increased prevalence, diminished criminal justice capacity. And the final key for them is the political one. Can they gain access to sufficient funding to insulate themselves politically? Can you win in California? Where does the money come from? From the available commercial operations. So it is a campaign, just be aware, it's gone on for several decades globally, varying degrees of success and rollback, and now it's in Colorado, and likely these are parts of an agenda that will broaden, and it's been doing pretty well. Marijuana prevalence, factors driving its use. As we know from Monitoring the Future and other analyses, it appears that perceptions of risk are critical, for youth at least. That's why medical marijuana is so effective, because it reduces the perception that this is scary stuff. No, it cures cancer. High school kids will tell you that. And is now at its lowest point among seniors. 68% dropped since 2008. 1 in 5 seniors know the past month either, and they'll tell you it's just not that damaging. There's nothing wrong with it. I read about it in the paper all the time. It's actually helpful. I expect others should try it. And the norms of acceptability, including parental judgment. Parental judgment turns out to matter. And I love the phrase that was used by our education specialist. He said, guardian confusion. Now, that makes a difference when there are not clear-cut calls for what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And in particular, the norms of acceptability expressed by peers. This is a pediatric onset disease. Let's take the disease model seriously. It's a behavioral disease. It's not an infection, but it's spread by behaviors and behaviors of the peers. The vectors are the peers, and largely in school settings, and then in Twitter and social media. And they accept the acceptability, and then they become the source for the provision of the substance itself. And we got to interrupt those vectors. We must take the disease model seriously and use an epidemiologic intervention. Then we would do things like test and monitor and trace and look for vectors and take the pump handle off the pump, if you know the history of epidemiology. Because the drug itself is a form of pathogen. And the epidemiology of use shows that there is a particular window of vulnerability, largely between 12 and 20 years of age, that either sets the pattern for dependent life experience of drug using and alcohol dependency and others, or resists that through a prevention dimension. And if you can keep youth from becoming heavily involved in drugs between 12 and 20, there will be a lifetime benefit. They'll continue with them. The patterns that are negative will carry out, and we'll see grandma with her dope from the 60s because she was at Woodstock, and we will see the kids from 2001 to 2008, and we will see a dip throughout their lifetime that they will use less. That is the critical battle. Is a 12 to 20-year-old, can you eliminate, diminish, or control the degree to which the behavioral disease is transmitted to them? And we are now into the unknown. The potency, developmental age impact, we simply don't know. Reduce the presence, interrupt the vectors of transmission, and I would recommend, this is my sort of last shot here, and I'll open up for questions. It's 5 minutes good, it's my last thing. We tried this at federal level with grants. It's been controversial. I believe the record is that it's worth trying. Student drug testing as one of the best target hardening prevention measures you can engage in. Not punitive where you expel somebody who tests positive. It's done more in the model of a screening and intervention, the same way you would do breast cancer screening or screening for familial abuse. As a matter of fact, you can use early onset substance use as a tracer, as an indicator of trouble at home. Sexual abuse of also learning disability, broken family, being threatened, early onset adolescent drug use is a way of capturing attention to a problem that emerges before it gets into the criminal justice system at age 18, when it manifests itself. If you can do early screening and intervention, I say non-punitive, but with the goal of, if you detect positives, you make an intervention with a school counselor, with a school nurse, with a physician, with the families. You don't always have clear guardians, but sometimes you do. And you can turn it around, but it also helps with the peers. And it has to be a particular type. It has to be random student drug testing. Supreme Court has upheld that. It can be done. And you can link it to school activities that kids want to do, like sports and band and drama. It matters, and it seems as if the record is, if you do random student drug testing, it gives them a protective shield. They can tell their peers, here's why I can't use them playing football. And it also, it seems to me, gives them a capacity to know who's in trouble and to help them. My youngest is now, in her late 20s. She was in high school when drug use had really exploded in our area. She became, as best as possible, a peer guardian, but she could not exercise resources and intervention. She could try to counsel and hope and hold, but we lose too many, and we're not doing this, and it seems to me it's worth trying again, though it's been largely eliminated as a federal program by the Department of Education. And as you can see, the schools are not always welcoming of this. I'm not quite sure always why. The educational community is wary, and there are arguments, well, it drives the kids away from us, and it makes them back in the shadows. I don't know. It seems to me that it is worth a well-crafted program that is effort not to hurt, but to help with the screening, and a response that's positive is worth getting to, because if you can get that kid at 13, or you can get that young mother at 15 who just got pregnant, you can leverage a difference in a generational battle, and that is this length of time you've got to sustain effective policies without reversing them, is a generation, and you can make a difference in that. Those are our options here. Otherwise, I think the culture has changed. I think the culture is rolling a little bit out of control. We pushed our foot down through rotten floorboards. There are no brakes. I don't know where this goes. It's deeply concerning. It's hard to know how to turn it around, particularly without the voice of the media or a popular culture that's giving us scenarios of acceptability of a kind of crazy, inhibited culture of drug use that will produce a generation that will not have judgment because they will themselves be damaged. I'm not sure. Ma'am?
I was just wondering if a school implemented that, which I think would be awesome, what would I know that there would be parent ramifications, but what about legal ramifications?
By and large, the tests have been brought to court Legal ramifications meaning, is it constitutionally acceptable?
Yes.
Legal ramifications meaning, I think if you do not punish or damage, that you're not likely to, I mean, the kid's lawyer will show up with the parents in tow, and there will be a contest. But my impression is you can make the case and prevail that you're doing something like expecting immunization before you go in the first grade. You know, it's something, one of the things we do. This is a behavioral disease, it's transmitted. We are protecting our community and we're helping the kid who first shows this sign. I think you can win that. The question is, where's the money coming from? And it used to be we had some federal grants to the Department of Education that could defray the cost. It's not great. You can do for about $30 a student drug testing program per student, about the cost of sneakers. It's doable, but you have to commit to it, and there will be pressure back. Sometimes it's from the educators themselves. But it's been done successfully in some communities, New Jersey and Southern California, and the results seem to be that it helps, and that other prevention programs, messaging, media campaigns, school training can get traction when this is present. I think it's a tool, it's not a magic bullet. Other questions? No, Doctor.
Appreciate everything you said. I still remain with some uncertainties with regards to the heavy supply side model because of other things that are out there, like the RAND Corporation study from economic evaluation of the various processes.
Very familiar with it.
Yeah. The one thing I would like to amplify that you said is this issue around prohibition. One of the things that's really important is we get messaging that's simple and direct and actually engages the opposition, so to speak. And one of the things is prohibition doesn't work. Well, it depends on what you look at with regards to prohibition. If you actually look in the 1920s, death from cirrhosis significantly went down.
And was sustained. They actually made a huge
and then it climbed back up. If you look at some studies at remote native Eskimo villages in Alaska where prohibition went into effect, that really did work. And so we actually have to engage at the level of relatively simple, direct messaging about this and not simply disengage from a conversation about prohibition. It doesn't work. And then there's a vacuum from our side about not responding to that.
Two very good points, and I think that the argument can be made that we haven't done it, well, it has been done academically, a proper cost-benefit analysis. There were huge societal benefits. Now, whether the cost was too great, all right, that's a public policy call. But whoever argues against prohibition, just Al Capone and Valentine's Day, boom. Well, hang on, there really were some benefits that were public health, realizable. The ransom, I can't help but swing. Peter Reuter, an economist, and they did do an analysis of the marginal dollar spent in public policy. Where do you spend it? Should you spend it in Colombia on supply reduction? No, it'll never work, it has no impact, because the value of the drugs goes up so dramatically when you smuggle it through. Farm gate expenditures and spraying the crops just makes peasants angry, creates subversion and so forth, and then it's really the magnifying effect of the moving it and smuggling it, so the prohibition actually creates the value of the drug, and that's what keeps them in business, as contrasted with where they wanted us to spend that dollar, which was for every dollar spent on prohibition, you spend, or supply reduction, spend it on treatment, and it'll give you a $7 return. Well, hang on a second. There's no adequate measure of treatment outcomes because they only measure them until 90 days of the treatment experience itself, and they go. And the attrition rate is so high, they have no idea what happens to those people as whether they achieve abstinence or not. And then not only that, but there's been a moving goalposts. We now define drug use as a chronic relapsing disease in which you do not expect abstinent recovery, but multiple episodes, whoops, there goes that $1 versus $7, because what you actually experience are, you're supposed to provide multiple lifetime insurance covered episodes of treatment. Well, suddenly the calculus and the economics begins to change. Then it becomes actually not as clear where you put that dollar for the best return on your investment from a federal policy perspective. But worst of all is Reuter did not think about the sheer fact that when you eliminate the supply by 75%, there aren't alternatives. And it does cut off, and the Mexicans, cartels, had enormous difficulty getting access, and the market collapsed, and we saw a 50% reduction in American, on the streets, use of cocaine, as well as the cocaine overdose deaths. Supply reduction manifestly worked empirically, not because of an economic econometric Newtonian vacuum where they calculated it, but because we saw what happened when we so dramatically constrained supply and did not allow a balloon effect to take place. It just actually strangled the system and cost them too much to stay in business. That worked. Now, you can't do that with marijuana. The model is not exportable that way, but you can at least not make it worse, and you can, through eradication, through public messaging, and through attacks on trafficking and networks, at least cut down the illicit dimension of the smuggling. It's going out by mail, parcel post. Any other questions, or we'll probably need to move on here. Yes, ma'am.
So, David, how would you suggest that we overcome bad data or misrepresentative data? Because as you said, these databases are drying up, right? So, and then we have challenges here in the state of Colorado with accurate representation of what is actually happening in this state and how it's being misrepresented, I think, to other states. Frankly,
you're talking about the issue of youth use?
And in other countries, I might add.
Yeah.
And I mean, you've been to the United Nations, I've been to 3 drug meetings at the UN in Vienna and New York. I'm appalled at what you're talking about too. It's a global campaign, and you can see that one of the chief ways of attack is to remove funding for data collection and analysis. So how would you
How do we steer when we're blind?
what do we do?
Well, when there are data collections, I can at least say this. If you have a survey or a result or a measurement that is not in concert with a wide variety of other data dimensions, if you've got epidemiologic data, you've got drug market data, you've got adult use, you've got 18 to 25-year-old youth use, and then you've got young 12 to 17-year-old high school age use, and one of them is going off in this direction and all the other arrows are pointing consistently, and you cannot tell me how the presence of legal marijuana makes use go down under the model. Well, it's regulated, and that doesn't seem to operate, and certainly the others are going up. I would say, I would look that the most likely broken clock is the one that points in the opposite direction of what all your other data sets from law enforcement, from public health, from the CDC, from other surveys are telling you that you may have a broken instrument that needs to be revisited, but that's a data question.
I wish we had more time for more questions. Next time you're coming out for 4 hours or